Hello, my name is Stephen Houghton, and this is the second video in my series on English constitutional development and how it affected the United States Constitution, laws, and culture. Um, so, when we left off last time, Jean Santerre, John Lackland, had just managed to die, sadly not as rumor held it, of a surfeit of peaches, but rather of dysentery. But when he passed away, and his son Henry was just 9 years of age, and so his regents were in a big pickle because since he repudiated Magna Carta, the barons were in revolt again, and Louis of France was just about to invade. They had basically invited the barons, had invited him to come and take the throne in place of John. So there was a big problem. But his regents basically agreed that they would follow Magna Carta. They settled the barons down, and so Louis decided he had other things that he might do and went back to France. But because of that, the consultation with the barons became a regular part of royal government during this period, during the Regency. And Henry, when he also ascended to the throne, he kept that practice up of consulting with the barons. But he also concentrated a great deal of power in his own hands. He basically abolished a large number of the great offices of state and concentrated that power in his own hands. And that might have been fine if he had been a great war leader. But unfortunately, the thing that he inherited from his father was a lack of ability at war. And so he was, like his father, losing his lands in France. And that meant that A, he needed money, which he did get from Parliament, but B, it meant as he lost more and more lands, he was bringing over his defeated vassals to England and granting them lands. And this always causes trouble when you bring in foreigners and start giving them big positions in your country. That has a tendency not to go over too well. So in April of 1258, these events came to a head, and a group of the barons under the leadership of Simon de Montfort basically seized powers and instituted a new council, half of 24 barons, half of whom were chosen by the king and half by Parliament. Because it was during Henry's reign that the meetings of the nobles started to be called parliaments. So this plan, which I suppose I should say is called the Provisions of Oxford, worked out about the way you would expect it to work out. With the king and his opponents equally divided, instability was rampant. And this was resolved, at least initially, by Henry III appealing to the Pope, who dispensed him from his promise. But then he still had all of the problems that he'd had with France and the lack of money and so on. So the problem didn't really go away. And in 1265, it was resolved by Simon de Montfort raising his banner and gathering an army and meeting Henry III and Edward I at the Battle of Evesham. And there he defeated the royal forces and captured both the king and the crown prince. And so then, of course, he is basically in charge. But now Simon has a legitimacy problem. By what right does Simon de Montfort rule England other than that he's defeated the king in battle? So he calls a parliament. And as something of an innovation, it had been discussed in the Provisions of Oxford, but hadn't been done. He calls for representatives, 2 knights from every shire and 2 citizens from every chartered town. And this is really the first appearance of something like the House of Commons in the English Parliament. Though Simon de Montfort was defeated in battle later that year, later in 1265, nevertheless, an important precedent had been set, and it was a precedent that would be followed. When Edward I came to the throne in 1272, he was in the prime of his manhood. He was an experienced battle commander, had experience in administration, and he had experience with the constitutional experiments of his father's reign. But, like all kings, his revenues just never kept up with his expenses, especially the expenses of his conquest of Wales. If you've been to Wales, you've probably seen some of the great castles that were built there during Edward's reign, and they're magnificent. But the fact is, they cost a lot of money, and so throughout his reign, Edward had to call parliaments to raise the funds. And in 1295, he decided to follow the precedent that had been set in 1265 and called the Commons along with the Lords spiritual and temporal. That gets called the Model Parliament of 1295. When the Scots invade in 1297, Edward, desperate for money, issues an important document called Confirmatio Chartorum, which basically reaffirms Magna Carta and makes it a part of the common law, makes it pleadable in court. In 1207, once again on campaign, this time against the Scots, Edward I died of dysentery. The reigns of Henry III and Edward I set what becomes a recognizable pattern in English history. Weak kings tended to be dominated by their nobles, who needed the authority of Parliament, the moral authority of Parliament, to cover up their usurpation of royal authority, or to legitimize it. Whereas strong kings, who are active, needed money, and therefore needed Parliament to raise it. Edward II had two basic problems. The first was that his father had left him a war in Scotland, which he was unable to win. And the second was that he was addicted to rule by favorites, and he was unable to restrain himself from giving them extravagant gifts in land and money. And this was a problem that culminated with him being unable to protect his wife, Queen Isabella, from his latest favorite. He then compounded that error by sending Queen Isabella and his son, Edward, son and heir, to the King of France, her brother, in order to negotiate a treaty with him. Instead, she negotiated with her brother for an army, and she succeeded, and she came to England and marched on London. Now, Edward II's defense was about what you would expect it to be, and it was not long before he was defeated in battle, and he was captured fleeing London. Then Isabella called Parliament in her husband's name, and there on January the 13th, 1327, Parliament declared Edward deposed for abandoning the realm by trying to flee, and second, for being a bad king. And so he was deposed, and Edward III was crowned King of England. Edward III was a bold king, more in the mold of his grandfather. While starting the 100 Years' War with France may have been, in the long run, biting off more than England could chew, no one could question his martial prowess. Edward's wars, unlike his father's, were successful. He reconquered Normandy for the crown, and then defeated King Philip VI of France at the Battle of Crécy. And later that year, he defeated David II of Scotland at the Battle of Neville's Cross. But even a strong king like Edward needed money, and he needed to call parliaments to get it, more than 47 in all. It was during his reign that the office of Speaker of the House of Commons was established, and the Good Parliament of 1376 found a new way to control the king. by impeaching his ministers. And so this is an important point to pause and say that is exactly the same mechanism by which Donald Trump and President Clinton were called to account by Congress. Literally, pretty much the same. Impeachment is begun in the House of Commons and tried in the House of Lords in the United Kingdom, and is, indictment is done by the House of Representatives in the United States and then tried by the Senate. So that is another example of how English constitutional development influenced the American Constitution. When Edward III died the next year, that is in 1377, the throne passed to his 10-year-old grandson, Richard of Bordeaux. A long and interesting tale could now be told concerning the descendants of Edward III and of the internecine warfare between them. But that's not the point of this brief history of England. Suffice it to say that the 100-Year War cost lots of money, losing it was socially disruptive, and the throne changed hands a lot. It was, however, an important time of parliamentary development. During the 106 years from the death of Edward III to the victory of Henry VII at Bosworth Field, Parliament was called 77 times. Highlights of parliamentary action at this time include the deposition of Richard II in favor of his cousin Henry IV in 1399, the passage of the 40-shilling franchise in 1421, and this is an important one because first of all, it lasted in England for more than 400 years, but more importantly for us as students of American constitutional law and history, when the Constitution of the United States gives the power to set the qualification for electors, that is for voters, to the states, in most states, the law that is controlling who has the franchise is in fact still the 40-shilling franchise of 1421. So that's another example of English constitutional development coming right out into the time of the founding of the Republic. Other notable developments of this period was the deposition of Henry VI in favor of his third cousin, Edward IV. It should be remembered, however, that when we say that Parliament removed so-and-so from as king, what's really happened is that somebody's been defeated on the battlefield, and the person who would otherwise be king is being, don't want to say that Parliament is rubber stamping what's going on basically is would have been like an extra constitutional coup, except for the fact that Parliament by its actions has made it illegal and legitimate. Basically they make it constitutional and legitimate by act of Parliament. After Richard the Usurper was defeated by Henry VII at Bosworth Field, parliamentary development slowed. During Henry's 24-year reign, Parliament was called only 7 times, a rate about half as frequent as that during the preceding period. This is partly a reflection of the fact that it was a time of relative peace and prosperity, and partly because Henry VII really was quite a careful manager. But the slowing down of the rate of calling parliaments is a trend that's going to continue for some time after his reign, basically through all of his descendants. So I have more to say on the topic of English constitutional development, some of which I've already recorded, but I think here, just on the verge of the Protestant Reformation and the effect of that on the power of Parliament, is a good time to pause. And so I'm going to do that. Thank you very much for watching my 4th video with the 1215 project. And I look forward to talking with y'all again in the future. Have a nice day.